Imagine a small, unassuming town tucked between fields and back roads, the kind of place where winter overstays its welcome, and the silence feels too familiar to ever be threatening. On that weekend, families were dyeing eggs, preparing ham dinners, and settling into the kind of domestic normalcy that defines Midwestern living. No one imagined that by Sunday evening, Coldwater would become the center of one of the most disturbing real cases to ever be aired on Unsolved Mysteries, a story so strange and unsettling that it would later bleed into horror cinema. For years, the Depew family looked like the picture of normal: 2 parents, 3 children, and a quiet life. Dennis and Marilyn had been married for 18 years. Their kids, Jennifer, Julie, and Scott, grew up doing the things that kids in Coldwater did: riding bikes, going to school, and living in a neighborhood where everyone waved at each other. Dennis held 2 respected local jobs: property assessor as well as the high school counselor. Marilyn was soft-spoken, devoted, and deeply protective of her family. But everything that looked stable from the outside was unraveling behind closed doors. People who knew Marilyn would later recall small, careful comments that she had made, mentions of control, exhaustion, and a kind of fear that never quite went away. The marriage had been growing darker for years, and when Marilyn finally filed for divorce in December of 1989, it wasn't a sudden decision. It was survival. But for Dennis, the divorce didn't feel like a separation. It felt like betrayal. He became fixated on the idea that Marilyn had turned the kids against him, repeating it often enough that it became a kind of personal gospel. He didn't see a dissolved marriage. He saw a conspiracy against him. The court granted him bi-weekly visitation with the children, but they didn't want to go. They were afraid to be alone with him, afraid of the anger that simmered behind his calm exterior. And that rejection came from the very people he believed that he was entitled to. And it became the spark that ignited everything else. On Easter Sunday, April 15th, 1990, Dennis arrived for his scheduled pickup. The children refused to go with him, and voices rose. Frustration spiraled into rage, and Marilyn stepped between them and tried to defuse things. She tried, again, to protect her kids from the fallout of an argument that never seemed to end. But something inside Dennis broke open. In front of their children, he shoved Marilyn down the basement stairs, and her head hit the wall. The kids screamed, and one ran to the neighbor's house, shaking and calling the police. Dennis then carried a gravely injured Marilyn to his van and insisted that he was taking her to the hospital. But he did not drive toward any hospital. He instead decided to drive to the countryside. Not long after, Ray and Marie Thornton were out for a slow, uneventful Sunday drive on State Road 66. It was something that they did often, a kind and quiet ritual. They noticed a cream-colored van in their rearview mirror, tailing them a little too closely before speeding away. And a few minutes later, they saw the same van pulled beside an abandoned one-room schoolhouse on Snow Perry Road. It was the kind of building that still stood only because no one had bothered to tear it down, a relic with peeling paint and broken windows. Ray had slowed the car just enough that Marie could look, and in that brief moment, she saw him. A man hauling a blood-soaked sheet out of the back of his van. Not hurried in a chaotic way, but in a way that suggested grim purpose. Marie did something that would change everything. She quickly wrote down the license plate number on the envelope from the glove box. Then, the van reappeared, behind them and following. Ray described feeling something shift in the air, a tightening sensation, like prey being watched. And at one point, the man pulled onto the shoulder, stepped out, and began switching the license plates. In the middle of the day, on Easter Sunday, on an open road. This moment became the inspiration for the opening sequence of Jeepers Creepers, though the movie added supernatural flair. The truth was far more unsettling because it didn't need monsters or fiction to be terrifying. The Thorntons got to safety. They gave the plate number to the authorities, and police found matching tire tracks at the schoolhouse and blood confirmed to be Marilyn's. And by the next morning, highway workers discovered a shallow grave in Bethel Township. Marilyn had been shot once in the back of the head, an execution carried out coldly and quietly, far from the home that she tried so hard to keep safe. And Dennis disappeared. Inside the Depew home, investigators found 17 letters written by Dennis, long, spiraling justifications drenched in self-pity and rewritten narratives. They were attempts to vindicate himself. Not one contained remorse. They weren't confessions. They were excuses. Investigators noted how detached they felt, like a man arguing with himself on paper, trying to build a case to justify murder. And for 11 months, there was nothing. Dennis drifted under new names, through new towns, blending into the background of America. A man with a dead stare, a carefully trimmed mustache, and a van that had once carried a nightmare. And then came March 20th, 1991. In Dallas, Texas, a woman known publicly only as Mary was watching Unsolved Mysteries with her boyfriend. She knew him as Hank Queen, but as the segment about Dennis DePue came on, Hank's body language changed. He stood abruptly, claiming his mother was dying, and insisted that he had to leave immediately. He asked Mary to make sandwiches for the drive, conveniently pulling her away from the TV, away from the screen now displaying the face of the man that she thought that she knew. Mary said later that she felt something in her stomach shift, a quiet dread that told her that she might never see him again. A friend of hers, however, did see the broadcast and recognized the van and made the call. Police located DePue near the Louisiana-Mississippi border that same night. A chase had ensued, sharp turns, blown barricades, and rural darkness swallowing headlights. Deputies eventually shot out his tires. Cornered and shaking, Dennis fired 2 shots through his own windshield at the officers. With no escape left, not from the law, not from the truth that he had created, he turned the gun on himself. A sheriff who had responded said simply, he intended to die that night, whether by police or by his own hand. Coldwater buried Marilyn quietly. Her friends remembered her warmth, her patience, and the way that she put her children first. The community mourned a woman who had tried to escape darkness and was caught by it instead. Dennis's memory, on the other hand, twisted into something else, part true crime and part folklore. The abandoned schoolhouse was torn down, but people still talk about hearing footsteps out there before it was demolished. Some claim to see a woman walking along the roadside near where their grave was found. A quiet, solitary figure who vanishes when headlights get too close. Maybe it's imagination, and maybe trauma leaves a shade behind. The Unsolved Mysteries episode has resurfaced repeatedly online, on forums as well as on YouTube and the collective memory of people who watched it late at night. Viewers always comment on the same thing. This story feels different. It feels colder. It lingers. And maybe that's because it shows a truth that we don't like to acknowledge. Real monsters don't need basement layers or supernatural features. Sometimes they sit at the dinner table. Sometimes they teach your kids. And sometimes they wave at neighbors while mowing the lawn. And sometimes they drive a van down a quiet Michigan road on Easter Sunday. This case didn't need embellishment. It didn't need folklore. It didn't need fiction. The horror came from how suddenly an ordinary life can split open to reveal the darkness underneath. A marriage collapses. A man snaps. A Sunday drive becomes a turning point. And a TV show becomes a warning. A chance phone call ends a year-long nightmare. Marilyn's story echoes in Coldwater, and people still talk about her. Her children grew up carrying the weight of what happened, but not defined by it. Her grave is still visited by those who refuse to let her memory fade into shadow of the man who took her life. The DePue case became famous because of the chase, the letters, the van, and the broadcast. But it endures because of something deeper, because it reveals the quiet, creeping truth that some of the darkest stories aren't found in legends or horror films. Sometimes they begin in a small town on Easter Sunday. And sometimes, the most terrifying monsters are the ones you already know. Hannibal, Missouri is the kind of town people romanticize from a distance. A quiet river town built on Mark Twain nostalgia, whitewashed fences, steamboats drifting along the Mississippi, and the lingering shadow of Tom Sawyer and Huck Finn. Adventure is part of the soil here. Exploring is practically a birthright. And in the spring of 1967, 3 boys from Hannibal, Joey Hagg, age 13, his younger brother Billy, age 11, and their friend Craig Dowell, age 14, set out to chase that same spirit of adventure. And they never came home. To understand what happened to them, you have to understand the place where they were drawn to. Murphy's Cave, one of the most storied caves in Missouri's underground labyrinth. The cave had a history thick with rumor and legend, stories that went back to 1840, when it was owned by a man locals called the Mad Doctor. His real name was Joseph Nash McDowell, an eccentric physician with obsessions that blurred the line between science and the occult. McDowell didn't believe burial freed the soul. He believed suspension preserved it. And after his 14-year-old daughter, Amanda, died, he placed her body in a giant alcohol-filled copper cylinder and hung it from the ceiling inside Murphy's Cave, convinced that her spirit would speak to him. Locals whispered that Amanda's ghost still moves through the tunnels. Children dared each other to knock on the cave walls and listen for knocks back. And by 1967, the cave entrance sat just south of Hannibal off of Highway 79, partially blasted away for construction. Workers hadn't bothered to put up warning signs or barriers. They didn't think that anyone would go inside. But they didn't know Joey, Billy, and Craig. On May 10th, after walking home from school, the boys talked excitedly about making another late-night trip into the cave. They had been told, repeatedly, not to go anywhere near it. Their parents grounded them that evening, stern warnings and all. But the boys slipped away anyway, with shovels, with flashlights, and with the same sense of daring that makes stories worth telling. And by morning, they were gone. Hannibal woke up to panic. The boys were officially listed as missing on May 11th. What followed became the largest cave search in modern American history. Professional spelunkers descended into the tunnels for hours at a time. The National Guard arrived, and even psychics poured in the town to offer theories, visions, as well as explanations. The newspaper called them the Lost Boys. The caves were treacherous, narrow passageways, sudden drops, dead ends, and pockets full of stale air. Searchers believed that the boys had been caught in a cave-in to deep underground, and dozens of volunteers risked their lives trying to find them. But the boys seemed to have vanished into sheer nothing. No footprints, no discarded shovels, no flashlight fragments, no clothing. Nothing. As days bled into weeks, speculation grew stronger. Psychics claimed that the boys weren't in the cave at all, that they were in one of the abandoned buildings scattered around Hannibal. Those buildings were searched top to bottom. Empty. Every outhouse, shed, and cellar was inspected. And nothing. And then, a stranger appeared. Hannibal wasn't new to travelers. Mark Twain tourism kept a steady flow of visitors passing through. But this man was different. He appeared suddenly, spent most of his time lurking in the woods, and vanished just as quickly as he came. Locals noticed him helping with the search, just enough to be seen, but not enough to be known. Some swore that the boys never made it to Murphy's Cave that night at all. They believed the stranger led them into the woods, or worse, the boys went looking for them. Rumors swirled, and then the rumors grew teeth. Hannibal, Missouri sits roughly 300 miles from Chicago, within reach of one of the most prolific serial killers in American history, John Wayne Gacy. In between 1972 and 1978, Gacy murdered 33 young men and boys, burying many beneath his home, discarding others in rivers and ditches. And although his confirmed crimes began in the early 70s, accounts later surfaced that Gacy had visited the Hannibal area throughout the 60s. And a theory emerged, one that refuses to die even decades later. What if the stranger wasn't a stranger? What if the Lost Boys of Hannibal were Gacy's earliest victims? The infamous killer was executed on May 10th, 1994, exactly 27 years to the day that the boys disappeared. Coincidence? Perhaps, but eerie enough that true crime historians, authors, and psychics keep returning to it. Minnesota author John Wingett investigated the case for years, publishing The Lost Boys of Hannibal and Souls Speak, Missing. Wingett spoke directly with psychics who visited the cave site and surrounding woods. They all had claimed the same thing, that the boys were never in the cave at all, that they were taken, kidnapped, tortured, and killed, and that the killer was a man who fit Casey's profile disturbingly well. Wingate didn't claim psychic evidence as fact, but he couldn't ignore the consistency, and neither could the locals who remembered the strange man in the woods, the one who had appeared and disappeared like a shadow. Despite the overwhelming search efforts, the caves were eventually abandoned, and for decades, no progress was made. And then, in 2006, while construction resumed near the original cave system, workers uncovered a new entrance, untouched for years. Experts were called in, new tunnels were mapped, and new passages were explored. And still, no sign of the boys. No bones, no clothing, no tools, no trace. No trace. More than half a century had passed since Joey, Billy, and Craig walked towards Murphy's cave with their flashlights and shovels. The people who had searched for them had grown old. Many had died. The cave entrance is long gone now, sealed beneath development and time. The story of the lost boys settled into the town's memory like a bruise, always visible, always aching. And every few years, someone brings up the case again. Someone proposes a new theory. Someone wonders whether the truth lies buried beneath Hannibal's shifting underground, or whether it walked out of the woods disguised as a stranger. Some mysteries fade with time, others dig it deeper, refusing to release their hold. And in Hannibal, a town built on stories of adventure and boyhood wanderlust, 3 boys slipped into legend not by exploring the cave, but by disappearing into it. And 54 years later, the coldest question still hangs over Highway 79, echoing throughout every retelling of the case. Were the lost boys victims of a cave collapse? Or something far worse? Maybe one day the truth will surface. Maybe one day Joey, Billy, and Craig will be found. And maybe one day Hannibal's lost boys will finally come home. Until then, they remain exactly where their name implies. Some serial killers grow out of violence like a twisted vine, slowly, gradually, and invisibly, until the shape is unmistakable. Others grow out of trauma. Others grow out of opportunity. And then there are killers like Larry Dwayne Hall, whose origins read like a perfect storm. A background steeped in death, a damaged mind, and an obsession with the past that would become the blueprint for some of the most haunting crimes the Midwest has ever seen. Larry Hall was born on December 11th, 1962, in Wabash, Indiana, one of a set of identical twins. And from the very beginning, his life was shaped by something dark. In utero, his brother Gary had begun absorbing him, a phenomenon known as monochorionic twin cannibalization. Larry was deprived of oxygen at birth, spending his first few days in the NICU fighting for survival, already neurologically compromised. Their father, Robert, worked as a cemetery sexton, a groundskeeper of the dead. Their mother tried to keep the home warm, stable, and normal, but it was hard when your childhood backyard was made of headstones. Larry was different from the other children, quiet, withdrawn, a target. He struggled academically, scoring in the low 80s on IQ tests. Kids mocked him for being slow, for his speech impediment, for the bedwetting that he couldn't control. And night terrors racked him. He rarely slept well, and he never fit in. And then there was his father's way of toughening the boys up. Most parents don't introduce their children to death until absolutely necessary. But Robert Hall introduced Larry at 12 by having him help dig graves. It wasn't long before Larry took the next step on his own, robbing graves, pocketing jewelry and personal keepsakes from the dead, a morbid apprenticeship that fed something festering inside of him. And when Robert lost his job, thanks in part to his alcoholism and reports of him burying bodies in the wrong plots, the family slid into poverty. They moved into a cramped one-bedroom shack on the outskirts of town. The Hall boys became known for trouble, smashing storefront windows at 15, breaking into buildings and lighting fires. The townsfolk saw them as nuisances. No one yet understood what Larry might become. And school brought no refuge. Larry remained the bullied outsider with the strange mannerisms and the vacant stare. He drifted through adolescence, unnoticed, unremarkable, until he graduated high school and found work as a janitor. And for most, it would have been a humble beginning. But for Larry, it was a mask, a place to hide in plain sight. But beneath the surface, something else begins to take shape. a passion that would become both his sanctuary and his hunting grounds. He fell in love with living history, reenactments of colonial battles, frontier life, and most importantly, American Civil War camps. The lore, the pageantry, the costumes, the anonymity of slipping into another identity. Larry attended reenactments across the Midwest, Indiana, Illinois, Wisconsin, Ohio, as well as Missouri. He pitched tents, carried replica rifles, cooked over open fires, and found himself surrounded by crowds of women, teenagers, and families with their guards down. To most reenactors, it was an innocent hobby, but to Larry, it became a roadmap. Because according to the FBI, Larry used these events, and the long stretches of highway between them, to stalk, abduct, and kill young women across multiple states. He often traveled alone. He had access to remote fields, wooden areas, abandoned barns, and endless rural sprawls of the Midwest. He fit in without being remembered. He would leave a reenactment, find a girl walking home, hitchhiking, or simply outside alone, and he would take her. For years, young women disappeared along these routes, their bodies often turned up buried in shallow graves, strangled with rope or ligature, showing signs of being bound or gagged. Many cases went cold, and others were chalked up to runaways. Larry drifted under the radar, a quiet, strange man with no criminal record beyond petty mischief. No romantic relationships, no clear motive, no reason to suspect him, unless you looked hard enough. And then, in 1993, everything had changed. On September 20th, 15-year-old Jessica Roach vanished from Georgetown, Illinois. Witnesses recalled seeing a strange man lurking in a blue Dodge van. And days later, hunters found Jessica's body in a cornfield. She had been suffocated. A composite sketch circulated, tips trickled in, and for the first time, someone mentioned Larry Hall. When police interviewed him, Larry admitted that he'd been in the area. He claimed that he didn't know Jessica, but he had always said that he had dreams of abducting and killing girls. He described ropes, tape, and shallow graves, too detailed to be a coincidence. And soon after, 15-year-old Trisha Rettler vanished in Marion, Indiana, and Larry had admitted that he had abducted her too, but insisted that he couldn't remember. He claimed that he blacked out when he got angry, and investigators later found rope fibers in his van. Hall was arrested for Jessica's abduction and murder, but even then, the confession wavered. Sometimes he had admitted everything. Sometimes he even recanted. And other times he said that he was just talking about fantasies. His IQ made it hard to know what was delusion and what was truth. But investigators believed that they found far more than one killer of one girl. They believed that they had uncovered a serial predator who had been operating for over a decade. And then Larry dropped a bombshell. He had told the FBI that he had killed probably 30 or 40 girls. But as quickly as he had said it, he took it back, and then confessed again, and then denied it, and then claimed that he only talked to get attention. But the FBI noticed something chilling. Larry knew details about missing girls from states that he had traveled through. He could describe clothing. He drew maps. He named counties. He mentioned abandoned barns that only locals knew about. And still, without bodies, without trace evidence, without hard forensic connections, he could be charged in most of the cases that he spoke about. He was convicted of kidnapping Jessica Roach and given a life sentence. But the deeper that investigators looked, the darker that the picture became. They suspected him in the disappearance of Michaela Mickey Cheney in 1993, the murder of Lori Deepies in 1992, the disappearance of Carmen Robinson in 1993, the murder of Polly Ann Klass in 1993, the disappearance of Wendy Felton in 1991, and the abduction and murder of multiple unidentified Jane Does. And then there was the Jimmy Keene operation, the basis for the book In with the Devil and the Apple TV series Blackbird, in which Keene was sent undercover into a federal prison to befriend Hall and extract confessions. Hall spoke freely, describing how he stalked girls, abducted them, and buried them. He even drew maps, but his drawings were vague, intentionally misleading, or possibly the result of delusion. And to this day, none of the missing girls' bodies had been recovered from the locations Larry pointed to. And that is where the case remains suspended, between confession and denial, between truth and hallucination, between what Larry did and what he only fantasized about. But what experts agree on is this. Larry Hall is likely one of the most prolific serial killers in American history, but due to the lack of physical evidence, he can only be convicted of one confirmed murder. From the perspective of investigators, the chilling part isn't what they know, it's what they'll never be able to prove. Because unlike most killers, Larry drifted across dozens of towns over 2 decades. He targeted victims who were small, vulnerable, and often alone. He buried bodies in remote woods. He burned evidence. He never kept trophies, except for the ones that he stole from graves. There may be mass graves across the Midwest that will never be found. There may be families still waiting for answers he took from them forever. There may be truth buried in fields, in forests, in caves, or along the same roads that he traveled in his Civil War uniform. Prison interviews show a man who smiles as he talks about death, who confuses dreams with reality, who claims that he doesn't remember what he did, but enjoys describing it anyway. And Larry Hall still lives, incarcerated, but breathing. A living ghost with secrets he refuses to give up. The FBI believes that he killed far more than he has ever been charged with. Maybe 30, maybe 40, maybe more. But unless a body surfaces, unless a confession becomes clear, unless one of those vague maps finally leads somewhere, Larry Dwayne Hall will go down as a name that everyone knows, but as a shadow moving behind countless unsolved disappearances. A man whose life was shaped by death, and who spent decades returning the favor.